Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Ask an Archaeologist. I'm Garrett Fessler, and I'm one of the archaeologists for the city of Alexandria. Every Friday for the month of May, we've been hosting this Ask an Archaeologist event on Facebook Live. Today, I am joined by two of my favorite colleagues, Dr. Ben Skolnick, who is one of the city archaeologists along with myself, and Emma Richardson, who is our archaeology educator extraordinaire. So welcome, guys, to Ask an Archaeologist.
Thanks for
you
having
can say
us.
hello. Yeah. So today's topic, we thought, since I'm joined by these eminent archaeologists, is to talk about how archaeologists know what they know. How do archaeologists think about what they dig up in the ground? And the site that we're going to talk about is the one that's been attracting lots of attention over the past several years, which are some of the findings on our waterfront, the 4 wooden ships that have been found on our waterfront. So basically the situation is that over the last 3 or 4 years, the city has made a push to redevelop its waterfront. And over the course of that push, there have been 4 ships that have been discovered in a fairly small area along our city's waterfront. And within about a 1-block area, these 4 ships were discovered. And so that has basically given us the gift of an archaeological site or sites to try to figure out what about these ships can help us to understand more about the city of Alexandria and the people and its past. So what I thought we'd do is we'd kind of go through the exercise of talking about some of the questions that we frequently are asked about these ships. And I'll have you guys kind of talk about how you guys are processing the information and trying to figure out our best understanding of those ships. Does that sound like a plan?
I'm all in.
Can't wait. Okay. So I thought, for the first question is that we often get is one of the broadest questions, which is sort of how did these ships get there? Like, why are these ships on the waterfront here? So Ben, how about you kind of grapple with that question? Let's see where you can go with that one.
I mean, when you look at any of the photos from the excavation, or if you were there and you saw these ships in the ground before they were excavated, I think most people were sort of struck by the fact that these are boats, and boats are supposed to be in the water, and yet we didn't excavate them out of the water. We excavated them on dry land, and ordinarily, when you excavate a ship, you're an underwater archaeologist, and you're wearing scuba gear and tanks and flippers, and you're communicating with hand signals underwater, and you can see, 6 inches or a foot in front of your face. But we had backhoes and shovels, and I was wearing regular shoes and doing it all on dry land.
Right.
And so when we excavate down on the waterfront, one of the things that we're aware of is that throughout the city's history, there's been this process of filling in the river. And it's a fairly well-documented process. When you look at old maps from the city, what you see is that the town was originally founded on sort of a shallow crescent-shaped bay or a cove. And then over time, that shallow cove gets filled in with dirt and rocks and earth and ships too. And one of the things that we can document through maps and deeds and other kinds of records that show land is this banking out process, this filling in of the waterfront. And for the most part, it happened sort of in the last decade or two of the 18th century, so starting 1780, 1790, and then a good chunk of it happens between then and, say, 1800 or 1810. A good portion of what's now the Alexandria waterfront gets turned from river into land. And
so did they just park the boats there and just kind of let the land cover them, or was this on purpose?
It's a good question, and it's probably a little bit of both. I mean,
Okay.
I think you can see parts of either. When you pull up old photographs of the waterfront and you look sort of along all the wharves and piers, there are very few photographs that I've seen that don't have like old junky boats, dismasted, dismasted,
Right.
with no masts, with no rigging, no tackle, just sort of pulled up along the waterfront. Sometimes they're filled with water and they're just sort of sitting there. And I imagine sediment and dirt and debris just sort of fills in, and then over time that becomes new land. But we also see it very deliberately, very deliberate actions taken to sort of take these ships and sort of process them a little bit and turn them into dirt-holding receptacles, dirt-holding structures.
Boy, describing them as dirt-holding structures isn't as romantic as clipper ships. But
there's no pirates, there's no salty sea breeze. But it's what's I mean, if you go down to the waterfront and you throw dirt into the river, it's gonna float down the river, and you're not gonna have new land. So you have to sort of find a way to contain what you put in the river.
Right.
So that you're the owner of brand new waterfront real estate and not your neighbor or George Washington down the river.
Right. So Emma, how are some of the ways that you all have tried to figure out how old these ships are? I mean, they're old, right?
It depends on what you mean by old, but to me, they are very old. So there are a lot of different ways to date something in archaeology, right? There's relative dating. So you can say, because one thing is on top of another thing, that must mean that this object was there after this one was here. So that gives you a general range, and there are a couple different other ways to do relative dating. But the great part about these ships is that they're wooden. And when it comes to wood, we can actually get a much closer date using dendrochronology. So if you take that word apart.
You mean the tree ring dating thing, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So dendro and chronology, dendro is the tree and chronology is that sequence over time. And because in my house I have a lot of different things, I happen to have a slice of a tree here. So if you picture a tree as it's growing, what will eventually become part of a ship, the very center, that's where that beginning sapling starts to grow. And every year it grows, for most trees, they grow another ring, especially in North America. So as that grows every year, those rings tell a story. It's sort of like a diary entry of every year. The tree is basically recording what the weather is like. So if you have a really thick ring, the tree was able to grow a lot. So you know that it's probably a really good year for the tree. It was probably raining a lot. The tree is able to grow. And we know just here in the mid-Atlantic that the weather in the mid-Atlantic is very different than it is in other parts of the country from year to year. And over time, that changes as well. So looking at those sequences of tree rings.
And you've been able to do this for at least one ship, right, so far?
Right. So the first ship that was discovered in 2015, 2016, that we've had a chance to be able to send that off to gain that additional evidence. So taking a sample of many different parts of that ship and comparing them to known sequences over time. So say this is your known sequence over time, you can see that there are thick rings and thin rings. If you take a core sample of the wood, and actually many were taken, you can compare those rings from the ship's wood to be able to find a match. So that
and you can kind of see you're almost at the match.
I'm almost there. Yeah, so that very last ring that was made by the tree before it's cut down
Right.
is a pretty clear signal to dendrochronologists that that was the last year that tree was alive. Once it's cut down, it maybe dries for a while before they use it for a ship, but that's a pretty close date. And because weather is different from different areas of the country and the world, you not only get a date of when that wood was cut down, but even where it was growing. So for that one ship, we know that it was cut down in the early 1740s and was right around the Boston area.
Boston, not Virginia.
Not Virginia. So whether or not that ship was built around Boston or if that wood was cut down and shipped another place before it was built, we don't know. But that's another question we can maybe answer in the future with more evidence.
Cool. So Ben, so part of your job is to sort of try to pull lots of these different strands of evidence about the ships to make some sense of that. So what do we know at this point about these ships?
Well, to keep talking about dates for a second,
Okay.
we know the wood was cut down sometime after 1741.
Right.
But we also took dendrochronology samples of a wharf structure that the ship was parked up against. I guess docked. If you're a boat, you dock, you don't park.
Right. Right.
And so the dendrochronology on that came back super good. I mean, it came back with the date that that wood was cut down in the winter of 1773 to 1774. And that's great because it corresponds to a known period of wharf building that happens on that site. The tenants in the nearby warehouse change on January 1st of that winter. And so right around 73, 74, we see a whole lot of activity happening on this block. And we're fairly confident that this wharf goes in 73, 74. Right. So this ship is docked up against a wharf that doesn't exist before the winter of 1773, 1774. And that gives us a pretty good start date for when this thing could end up in the ground.
Do you know where was the wood, the 1774 wood? Was that from Boston too?
Nope, that's local. And that's what you
cool.
sort of expect. It's a lot easier for wood that's been shaped into a ship to make it down from Boston than it is for a wharf to float down the Atlantic Ocean and then turn up Chesapeake Bay.
You know, good point. Very good point. Cool. So that gives you the idea that the ship had to have been put up against that wharf after 1774. What else have you been able to extrapolate?
Well, so like with a lot of archaeological artifacts, we're sort of dealing with some fairly anonymous material remains. Our ships, I mean, they're sort of bottoms of sides of ships, what's left of them. You know.
So they're not whole ships mostly.
They're not whole ships. They've been sort of cut up and processed. I think some of it got turned into firewood. And then, I mean, you can see on certain timbers axe marks and saw marks where you can see they were preparing this thing to go into the ground. You know, we don't have a transom on the back with the name painted across it. It seems that chopping up and disposing of old ships was a fairly common occurrence. I mean, you had to do something with them. And so nobody wrote a letter home to their mother. Dear Mom, today I saw the most amazing thing. They chopped up an old ship and buried it. It was named the such and such, and it's located at exactly these coordinates. And it seems like a fairly common thing. Like when it's trash day, you don't write a letter to your grandmother. Today the trash came and it was the most amazing thing. It just happens, and it doesn't get recorded in the historical record. So we're sort of left with pieces of wood that we can do dendrochronology on. We can look at the number of pieces we have, the curvature of it, and we've had some experts go ahead and reconstruct these four ships for us based on the remains that we have and extrapolate out the rest of the curves. And you can get a sense of how big they were, and maybe from some other evidence, the types of rigging they had, where they're going, the kinds of stuff they're doing. But I think a very useful line of investigation is to sort of look at what are ships doing, sort of in the broad picture. You know, what is mercantilism? What does commercial trade look like on Alexandria's waterfront? So if we can't name these specific ships, we can find out what ships in general are doing on the waterfront and sort of make a much broader picture to what these ships are doing.
Cool.
And there's a whole bunch of different avenues to go about answering those questions. There are sort of official records of ships and shipping that get created. Official customs records that record the names of ships coming into the port and ships leaving the port, along with who's sailing them and how big the ships are, how many people are on board, and the kinds of cargoes that they're carrying, down to the number of bags of coffee or shingles that they're bringing in.
So Emma, do we know what kinds of, were these ships involved in the slave trade?
So, like Ben was saying, there are a bunch of different ways we can make gather different evidence together and try and answer that question. And right now we don't have a definitive answer. But what we can do is we can look at that starting date of 1741 for one of those ships and say it wasn't sailing before 1741 because those trees were still in the ground and growing. And we have an end date because we have dated those wharf structures and we have historical maps that show when that shoreline is changing and filling in over the ships. So we have this window of time, and within that window of time, we can look at what ships generally are doing. So if we know the size of the ship and how the ship was built, it can tell us generally what kind of ship would have been used for things like cargo. We can then look at other historical documents and say, well, coming in and out of Alexandria were things like wheat and flour, fish, and at some points during that window of time, there were enslaved people that were coming in and out of the port, but not to the extent as they were later. So these ships, at least the first ship was earlier than the enslaved people trade that happened in Alexandria.
Oh, okay. So it's kind of like you build trucks for different purposes, right? So ships would be built for different purposes in general, but they could have been used for all kinds of things. We just don't know yet.
Exactly. And just like a truck, sadly, if you're using a truck analogy, trucks are used for carrying a lot of different goods. And a ship would have been the same. You wouldn't have had a ship that was dedicated to only carrying flour from place to place. Really, a ship is coming in and it's getting an order, and it's sailing out again with whatever is requested or they're hoping to sell in a different place. So one ship could have been used for a lot of different things over time.
So basically, one of the strands of evidence, because the ships were basically stripped of all of their rigging and their equipment and emptied out, then really one of the only ways to kind of figure out their use is through sort of their sizes and their shapes, and to some degree, and then also trying to put them into context in the dates of time that they were sailing, right? And so there's a lot of it sounds like there's a lot of guesswork.
Right, but that's what makes archaeology so exciting, right? Archaeology is a science, and with science, we're always asking questions. Hopefully, we always will have questions to ask. I've never run out of questions. I highly doubt the two of you have. We're always curious about things, and maybe one answer will lead to 5 other questions. And the only way to answer those questions is gathering pieces of evidence. So one piece of evidence, one historical map, or one sample of wood isn't going to tell us the whole story. We have to combine the material culture with the historical documents and then constantly interpret from those. And then as more evidence is found, add to those interpretations or change those interpretations. So it makes it so exciting.
In a way, it's kind of good that we don't know the names of these 4 ships, because it makes us have to learn about all of the ships and sort of understand what's happening on the waterfront, instead of just zeroing in on one specific ship and watching it sort of move around. You can paint a much broader picture, and I think come away with a much better understanding of sort of what's happening here in the past.
It kind of sounds like if we did know the names of these ships, it wouldn't be as exciting. It's kind of like the part of the fun is trying to figure them out, right? Rather than being told what they are.
I'm still working on it. I've got a list I've been working on
of your top possibilities.
So without having names, there's still a couple ways we can go about trying to narrow it down. I said a minute ago we have these customs returns for all of these years, and so they're sort of split up between which governmental body is doing it. So before 1775, 76, it's the British, and those people sort of they know how to run an empire, and they're keeping track of everything, and they're methodical, and there's this format they follow, and the lists are beautiful to look at. And then you sort of, after the Declaration of Independence, you have sort of the state of Virginia, the new state of Virginia is sort of following it. And then after the Constitution gets passed in 1789, you have sort of the new U.S. government take over the responsibilities of customs. And so the records are sort of split up like that. But you can sit down, and when they're mostly complete, especially in the British years, you can see all the ships that come into port, and then you can see the other list of ships that leave port. And theoretically, we have buried here ships that come in and then never leave.
Right.
And so theoretically, not counting ships that sneak off in the middle of the night or bribe the customs inspector to look the other way, we should have a ship that shows up and then just never leaves, because it hasn't left. It's buried there on the waterfront. So armed with maybe some information about the size of the ship that we can reconstruct, and hopefully a location where it's built, which is a piece of information that is also on these customs forms, we can make a fairly short list of potential ships that these could be.
Cool.
I hope so. A couple of the ships are sort of parked, docked, I guess, closer to the original shoreline, which seems to imply they were sort of dismantled and buried a little earlier. And those are probably pretty good candidates to look for in the British customs records. And then the other ones sort of are a little bit later. And my understanding is those collections aren't as easy to look through.
Right.
They're not as organized. People, when you go to the archives, either in DC or in Richmond, it looks like the guy handed the customs official his piece of paper, and he looked at it and he folded it up and he stuffed it in a drawer somewhere, and that drawer just got dropped off at the archives, and you have to recreate this record first.
Right.
So, but we still have avenues to pursue. It just takes a little bit of time to do some of the dendrochronology research and collect some of these records. So I'm not convinced all of them are going to remain anonymous forever, but
cool.
There are a couple things to do.
I wouldn't bet against you all. I bet you I wouldn't. I would say that you guys are going to figure it out at some point and come up with a name. I think, when you said that they would check in, but they never checked out, it reminded me of the Hotel California. So maybe that might be one of the names of the ships.
I don't know that I have the authority to delegate renaming powers to you, but if I do figure it out, I expect you to cover Hotel California with your own lyrics.
Oh, excellent. I will happily do that. So you got a deal. All right, guys, this has been terrific. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Ask an Archaeologist. And we're going to be back one more time next Friday with another episode. Have we figured out what we're going to talk about yet? Probably not. So
it will be answering. It'll be answering questions that people have, among other things.
That's right.
So send in your questions.
So we'll take the audience's questions and we'll come up with some awesome answers, as I'm sure we will. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next Friday. Bye.